That's another one to look up as well. But we're not going to be talking about Plato today. Julian's new book is called How the World Thinks, and it's precisely about those areas of philosophy and those philosophers who are not generally studied in courses in universities, certainly in the West. So Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, Japanese philosophy, the philosophers of the Islamic world, and other places as well. It's a real tour de force of a book, and one that I think nearly every reader will learn something new from. I know I certainly did. Julian, thanks for joining us. Maybe if we just start by asking you, can you just describe to us the typical syllabus of a philosophy course in this country? And, what would you normally study, and has it changed in recent years at all?
Well, to be honest with you, I don't know if it has changed much in recent years. I don't think a lot. I mean, essentially, the kind of courses you do are, you do some epistemology, theory of knowledge, and some ethics. You'll probably do a compulsory logic course. You might do political philosophy, even that might not be compulsory. But essentially, the sort of canon you're drawing on sort of goes back to these ancient Greek philosophers, Plato's and Aristotle mainly, and a few others. And then you kind of like skip through a few centuries. You might get a few medievals in, but maybe not. And then you really pick things up again with the early modern era, Descartes, Leibniz, Hume, Kant, all these familiar figures through to the 20th century. And also, interestingly enough, most of the time, there's a kind of, that canon sort of took a couple of different directions, kind of post-Kant. And in most British universities, you won't be paying any attention to those sort of strange continental Europeans, like Husserl and Heidegger and all these people, these phenomenologists. So they get excluded as well. So it's not just that it's exclusively Western, it's exclusively Western with a particular kink.
As it were. So what are we missing out on, or what are philosophy students missing out on? And how does this book try and plug some of those gaps?
Well, yeah, the question what they're missing out on is a good question, because when you sort of tell people who don't know anything about philosophy that, it is entirely Western, I mean, most people's initial reaction is that's just obviously scandalous. I mean, that's ridiculous, isn't it? You wouldn't sort of teach only, if you did a course in English literature, of course, you'd only do literature in the English-speaking world, but, you wouldn't just do art from the West or history of just the West. So why is it limited in those ways? And it's really because there is a perception, which is not a completely ridiculous one, that whatever else goes by the name of philosophy in other parts of the world, it belongs to a different intellectual tradition with a different set of assumptions and methods, and that whatever merits it has, it's just different. Philosophy is this particular tradition of thought, which goes back to the Greeks. That's why it's called philosophy. Philosophia, it comes from the Greek. And that's just what it is, for better or for worse, that's what it is. And, you pick up Confucius or whatever it might be, and it may be interesting, but they're not really doing what we're doing. And I think the reason why I ended up getting dissatisfied with that was, I think, well, a few reasons really. One is that there were increasing numbers of people who were writing about these philosophers in ways which made it more evident that despite the unusualness perhaps of the language and the style, you don't have to dig too deep to see that they are actually addressing a lot of the same questions, and in a similar enough way for it to count as the same subject. But the second thing was that I kind of felt that, look, even if it's not quite the same tradition, whatever you want to call it, isn't it interesting anyway? And your philosophy is supposed to be questioning about its assumptions and methods. Now, if you're going to be questioning about your assumptions and methods, surely you should have at least some curiosity about traditions which address the same kind of things you're interested in, using different assumptions and methods. So that's what I think what people are really missing out on is, different ways of thinking about the things that they are thinking about. And that's really, really debilitating, because again, philosophy is supposed to be about questioning assumptions, and you don't really know what assumptions you're making until you kind of see how other people don't make them when they're thinking about the same things,
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're looking at these other traditions, we'll dig into them more deeply in a second, but just generally, first of all, How difficult did you find it as somebody trained in the sort of traditional philosophy that you just described, philosophical tradition? How difficult did you find to get your head around the different, sometimes people starting from very different premises or just looking for different things or speaking in different ways about maybe some of the same issues?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And actually, funny you should ask that, because in some ways I didn't find it as difficult as I might have thought. And that's partly because how I set about doing it. Because, I mean, once I kind of became clear this was an interesting subject, and it'd be interesting for me to find out about. I mean, I'm quite selfish as a writer in the sense that I start off by thinking about something I would like to find out more about. And then if it seems to be something other people might be interested in, then I get the license to chase that ball, as it were. Obviously it became obvious you can't write about this by becoming an expert. Right, no one is an expert on all the world's philosophical traditions. There's one guy who's trying, actually, and I really take my hat off to him. Peter Adamson, you might have heard of. He's based in Munich, and it started as a podcast series called A History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps.
It's brilliant.
It is brilliant. Yeah. But he's on about episode 370 or something, and he's still in the Middle Ages. And it is absolutely remarkable. But this is a lifetime endeavour. It's now also becoming a series of books. So I'd suggest, if this whets your appetite, Adamson is the step up in terms of the level of detail going into much more. But I don't know how long it would take him to finish this. So you can spend your whole lifetime becoming an expert, and I probably just don't even have the ability to do that. Or you can approach it like as a kind of journalist. So I see it as it's philosophical journalism. I have my philosophical training, so I have certain skills and abilities, one would hope. I've also done quite a lot of journalism. And it's a question of, going to the people who really know, the best people who know, talking to them, asking them the right questions, putting it together in the right way, checking with primary sources, and trying to put it together like that. And I found that a lot of the time, although things did seem sort of strange and different, it was largely sort of comprehensible, I felt. But how far can you go with that? I'm sure there are people who might read elements of this book who are really deeply rooted in a particular tradition, who will think that at particular times, I haven't really got it yet, or whatever it might be. And I think that's inevitable. Although, so far actually, I've been free from that kind of abuse.
Well, the night is young.
Yeah. And, prospect readers, I'm sure they were. Yeah.
Let's take this, the Indian tradition, broadly speaking, to start with. And you start by going to a conference and listening to people discussing various ideas there. And you write in the book that actually, at the start at least, it seemed very different to a kind of Western philosophical conference. Could you just sort of give us an overview of what those differences are?
Yeah, I mean, I did a certain amount of travelling for this, and partly that was simply because I wanted to do the interviews. I had to go to places where people were, but also I felt, partly from a narrative point of view, but partly from my own understanding, I felt that to spend at least a little time somewhere would perhaps enable me to sort of perhaps find some little things that would provide some detail or colour, bring it to life. I don't want to suggest for 1 minute that I believe that by spending relatively short periods in these countries you sort of magically have insight into the secrets of their cultures. But the Indian one was very interesting because I wanted to go to Bodh Gaya because that was supposedly where the Buddha achieved his enlightenment. And I also wanted to go to the conference of the Indian Philosophical Congress, annual conference. And it happened to be in Bodh Gaya that year, so I was very, very lucky. And yeah, I mean, what was really striking about it was that it was this very deferential attitude towards the speakers. But not only that, the speakers were essentially it's like they were speaking on behalf of a school. So they had the key sort of plenaries at this conference were endowment lectures, and there were these endowments to give a lecture on ... But it was always a particular school or particular thinker. So there was like the Gandhi endowed lecture and the Vedanta endowed lecture, whatever it might be. And people gave up, and they gave these talks in which they kind of expressed their kind of knowledge and of their particular tradition. But there wasn't it wasn't that kind of thing you get in a Western conference of the speaker trying to demonstrate any great originality, for example. And there was no engagement, there were no questions with the plenaries, no discussion. And when I tried to interview a lot of the speakers afterwards, I found it was a bit difficult because I found I couldn't really interview them because they took questions as an invitation to give me another little lecture. Now, this is a bit peculiar, and I thought, well, you could kind of just sort of like try and explain this purely sociologically. Say, what is it about the Indian culture which makes people more deferential, whatever it might be, and there's also an element. There was also a running seam of hostility towards Western philosophy actually as well, which is perfectly understandable given the imperialistic sort of past. But I thought that's not good enough, because if you're looking at how say a British or an American conference has been conducted, sure, there would be insights from sociology there, but presumably the way it's conducted reflects certain ideals people have about what philosophy is. So, for example, that it involves the presentation of original ideas and that these get rigorous scrutiny from your peers, etc. And so I thought there's something about the way that the Congress progressed which did say something about the tradition. And again, interviewing people, this was kind of borne out, that there isn't that same emphasis on the individual thinker as an original thinker at all. In fact, most of the great Indian philosophers are known as interpreters of the previous traditions, the things they come from. So, Shamkara, for example, one of the names that always comes up, he's seen as interpreting the original sort of Vedas. And so originality, however, comes from the way in which you interpret it. There's still quite a lot of room for originality, but it's seen as much more about what you can bring to what's already there rather than how you can move away from it. And that was quite interesting. And of course, the other fact, simply that people did sort of see themselves as representing certain schools. As in many places other than the West, there is a certain sense of a kind of respect for traditions, and that, in a sense, it's all been worked out already in the past, and that the job of the present is to carry on the tradition and perhaps to elaborate on it a bit. But, whereas actually we kind of fetishize new stuff in Western philosophy, we're looking for the next breakthrough, the new thing. Even though, ironically, everyone studies Plato and Aristotle and Descartes as though they only published their books yesterday.
I want to just draw out this contrast, because it comes up throughout the book, really, between broadly characterised Western philosophy, which, as you say, searching after newness, sort of the idea that everything can be subject to scrutiny, a highly sort of critical attitude towards the past, and in a way, Western societies are built on those ideas, and the idea of the progress, or Western societies, you could say, or at least economic progress and all the rest of it, seems to go hand in hand with that. Do you think that something, for example, the Indian philosophers, do you think that because, to put it brutally, they were on the sort of the receiving end of Britain's progress in the Enlightenment, or to do with colonialism, that the idea of harmony or balance or tradition and respect for authority, all those things, seem to feel more attractive because the success of the West came to some extent at their cost?
I think that's part of it. I mean, the relationship between philosophy and culture is an interesting one. I had the idea at the beginning that maybe it was possible that by learning about the dominant philosophical traditions in a culture, you would learn something about that culture. And as I questioned people, pretty much everyone agreed that was the case. The cause and effect is more difficult to disentangle. I mean, the philosophies are products of culture, but they also then inform that culture. So it's a kind of a two-way process. I think that what you're saying is partly true. I think partly it's simply the fact that the very particular ideas which have become dominant in the West have enabled, if that's the right word, the West to kind of become exceptional in global terms, in that it has kind of untethered itself from a kind of a belief in tradition, the past as offering the real anchor, and has put its trust in what reason, science and philosophy will lead us to. So in that sense, the West has become the exception, and you don't really need to explain why other traditions are different. You need to explain why the West is different. On the other hand, if you want to help partly explain why it is that those ideas have persisted when it seems that for a few centuries now the West has been the most successful culture, and that people might be wanting to look to what we're doing right, I think you are right. You get a certainly in India, also in the Islamic world particularly, a sense that there's this kind of the Western narrative is sort of hypocritical and short-sighted, and that we tell this story that we're doing so brilliant and everything, but yet we've only because it's been at the expense of the oppressed countries, and the price we're paying for that are things like environmental degradation, not to say inequality and so forth. Often you also hear more conservative ideas coming out around breakdown of family and things like that. So there's quite a lot of traditional sexual ethics that gets swept into that. But on the other hand, I think why I wouldn't want to make too much of that is in the case of China, which of course China went through its period under sort of Mao of being very deeply un-Chinese in the historic sense. Clearly sort of just throwing out tradition and the four olds as they were called, and turning
Cultural Revolution,
turning the whole Confucian ideas on their head. I mean, it's hard to imagine what it means for in Chinese culture to say that children have to denounce their parents. I mean, that is historically the least Chinese thing you could possibly do. But and they did it very deliberately because they're really trying to shake that up. What's interesting, of course, is I think that these ideas are much, much more deep-rooted than people think they are, and that despite all of that, it didn't succeed in actually shaking this out. But I think in the case of China doesn't have that same sense of, it has had its issues with the West and everything, but I don't think it carries that kind of post-colonial kind of, if I say grudge, I don't mean that in a way that's not deserved, but kind of resentment of the other parts of the world, and yet it still has its value in tradition. So the resentment aspect of it is only part of the picture in some parts of the world, I think.
And speaking of China, Confucius seems to be back now. I mean, after being excoriated during the Cultural Revolution. And let's think about a figure like Confucius, because in a way you could compare him to someone like Aristotle. Just a founding figure. And is the strength somehow of these figures that we look at people over history, the interpreters, look at these figures and reinterpret them for every single age. So there looks like there's more continuity within that tradition than there maybe actually is. So, Xi Jinping can say that Confucius is our guide. That's quite different from 200 years ago when there was an imperial state and all the rest of it.
Yeah, no, that is right. It's quite curious. I mean, Confucius is back, but he's back in the form that suits the Communist Party. And that often means it's distorted. So, I mean, the ideal of harmony is the clearest example of that. There's a Confucian ideal of harmony, which the classic texts are very clear. Harmony requires difference, and it's not about imposing sameness on everything. But when the Chinese Communist Party promote harmonization, it's normally about making things the same. So it's un-Confucian, but it's using Confucian language. So there are a few things there. I mean, one is that understanding the kind of classical thinkers, in a way they can always be remade in our image, but they kind of provide a kind of set of concepts and a kind of vocabulary or a sort of framework within which things have to be worked out. So in China, harmony, whether if you're distorting Confucius or not, you have to justify what you're doing in terms of harmony in a way that in the West you have to justify it in terms of freedom and liberty. So people stand up in the name of freedom and liberty all the time, even when they're taking it away, but they have to use that language. So when you understand something of the classical traditions, you get a bit of a sense of what are the kind of core beliefs and assumptions that people have to appeal to, even if they're actually twisting them. The extent to which you say there's perhaps more continuity than might seem to be the case, I think that's true. I was struck about Aristotle, actually, because Aristotle these days, when he's studied at universities, it's almost always for his moral philosophy.
Yeah, virtue ethics.
Yeah, it's been a resurgence of that. But I remember a little while back, I watched one of those Brian McGee programs. There are people old enough to remember those in this room, aren't there? The Brian McGee interviews he had about the great philosophers. And he was talking with Martha Nussbaum about Aristotle. And Martha Nussbaum writes about Aristotle all the time in terms of virtue ethics. This 1 hour program was all about his metaphysics and his logic. It didn't talk about his ethics at all. So even in like 40 years, what we concentrate on in Aristotle in the West has shifted its focus for sure. But there's a kind of a palette, a vocabulary, a kind of framework, and that is constant, I think. Fairly constant.
One of the distinctive things about Western philosophy you've written about in here is the idea of secularization. So the idea that religion and philosophy, which were once very bound up together in the Western tradition, have been sort of prized apart. And do you feel, for example, looking at, say, philosophy in the Islamic world, that hasn't been the case in the same way? So do you want to just bring up the contrast as you see it?
Yeah. I mean, again, one sort of little footnote here is that in writing the book, I try and strike a balance between not pretending that I don't have my own prejudices and opinions, but at the same time trying to give fair hearing. And yeah, that's a delicate kind of balance to do. I mean, personally, I think the secularization of philosophy is a positive thing, so I'm in favour of it. But I think one has to recognise that it is globally exceptional. I think the Far East is different. We have to sort of perhaps talk about that slightly differently, maybe in a bit. But if you take, say, India and the Islamic world, it's certainly the case that the vast majority of philosophy has always remained entangled with the theology. So the orthodox schools of Indian philosophy all take the Vedas and those foundational texts as kind of revealed knowledge, which provide the basis of philosophy to come. And a lot of the non-orthodox schools have their equivalent kind of, canonical text, the early dialogues of the Buddha and so forth, and the Jain texts. And in the Islamic world, there was this huge kind of debate in the so-called Golden Age, in which it was never really a debate where either one side was in favour of complete secularisation and the other wasn't. But there was a kind of battle for the heart of it, in which the theological side did hold out. And so, as a result, yes, in those parts of the world, you can't. It doesn't even make sense to talk about philosophy as separate from theology, except in a few heterodox schools. There are always exceptions to this, and that's very difficult. But I think the point is that I think too often, sort of Western philosophers have used that as an excuse to pay no attention to those traditions. Now, the reason that's mistaken, well, there are a few reasons. First of all, if we were to think that is a reason to dismiss philosophy, we would have to chuck out a lot of our own canon as well. I mean, if you read Descartes' Meditations, I mean, that is most definitely the work of a philosopher who is a Christian in the Christian tradition, who is taking his Christian beliefs to be absolutely central to what he's doing. And even someone like Locke, who's not as overtly a religious thinker, his work on politics, I mean, he doesn't think that everyone, he's in favour of toleration, but not atheists, because atheists can't keep oaths because they've got nothing to swear an oath to. And certainly in Plato and Aristotle, it's quite interesting. Aristotle is different with Plato. The way people read Plato now is when Socrates goes on and talks about the gods and all these things, they're just taken as assumed to be little poetic asides just to provide colour. They're not taken seriously. Because I think a lot of people are coming around to the idea that actually, Plato probably did believe in these spirits and demons and gods, and it's convenient to ignore them because to ignore them fits our vision of what philosophy should be, but it's actually an anachronistic way of reading them. So first of all, if you are going to insist, no, the only true philosophy is that which has been purely secularised, we should be chucking out loads of our own canon. But the other point is that even in traditions where actually, it doesn't really make sense to do philosophy in separately from theology, there are aspects of those philosophies which are absolutely make sense and are useful to people who don't have the same religious assumptions. So Indian philosophy is a very good example of this, because there's a lot of the classical Indian tradition is the only tradition other than the Western one where there's really been a strong development of logic as a distinctive discipline. And the Indian texts on logic are fascinating, extremely rich. They're part of systems which, taken as a whole, have huge theological assumptions. But that doesn't mean that those parts of the systems, don't have a very interesting intellectual life separate from them. So, I think we just have to be careful not to chuck out the baby with the holy bathwater.
No, absolutely. And it was always interesting to me that even in traditional Western courses, you study Aristotle and Plato and the Greeks, and then suddenly, you just leap to Thomas Aquinas, and like there was a bit in the middle, there was and I'm talking really about the Arab philosophers, already Persian, Avicenna. And I was looking at a painting the other day, a medieval painting, a manuscript, I think from 14th century Italy, and it had a picture of Avicenna, and it had him with a little crown on his head. And apparently, because in the Arab world he was known as the sort of the great head thinker, the Sheikh al-Ras or something else, the medievalists thought he was a king, so they put a little crown on his head there. But that tradition, the tradition of sort of the Arab reinterpretation, or the Islamic reinterpretation of Greek philosophy, then went on to really quite profoundly influence medieval theologians as well. Did you say just a little bit about what, why we missed that out?
Well, why miss it out? Again, it's just rewriting the history to fit our current conception of the way we think it should be. I mean, it was not only just important for the development; it was actually important practically for the transmission of those texts. It was the translations, the Arabic translations of Aristotle and some other thinkers, which actually got them to Europe in the first place, right? So it was deeply important. Why is it left out? It just doesn't fit the narrative, I don't know exactly how and when, I can't point fingers at who's guilty of this. But what's quite curious is that no matter what school you're talking about, there always, at any given moment, there always is a kind of a orthodox version of its history, which is always dubious to a certain extent. And it just gets taken to be common sense. So, you pick up a history of philosophy, a history of Western philosophy, and, just assume it's right. I mean, Indian philosophy is interesting for this as well, because one of the things which I find an unresolved question for me is that every introduction to Indian philosophy will say to you there are these 6 orthodox schools and there are these 5 heterodox schools, and here's what they are, right? And that's very interesting. They all say it, so it's kind of true. As a philosophical journalist, I can report that. But I do kind of note that it's not actually clear where this category comes from. It seems to have been something that was invented late 19th century by somebody. And there are certainly people who think this is, those categories are somewhat fishy and don't quite make sense. But it becomes the orthodoxy. This is the way you tell history. And I think that questioning those things is very important as well. Because in Western philosophy, I find it unhelpful, for example, we have categories of philosophy. We have the rationalists and the empiricists. You asked me at the beginning, what are you taught in your introductory courses? Well, there were the rationalists and there were the empiricists. But actually, this is a post facto categorization. At the time, they weren't in different teams, but they get lumped together, and this gets the official history. And that ends up confusing things too. So it's always very difficult, and of course this book is an introduction to a broad sweep of things. So you always have to kind of do a certain amount of generalisation and simplification. But I'm hopefully trying to kind of always signal to people, always sort of beware of these things.
And one of the most interesting things is, and I'd love to know your opinion, to what extent have these remained, as it were, hermetic traditions, or in fact have they been even unconsciously influenced by Western philosophy and ideas and the ways of looking at things? Because the area that I know a little bit more about is sort of Islam and the Islamic world and philosophy. And I think it's definitely the case that in medieval times, the idea that the Quran as a absolutely central text was theoretically true, but in practice not actually true. And that there was a lot of sort of variation and what we think of as being more heterodox was actually sometimes more common than what was seen to be orthodox. And that it's only in a sort of odd sort of absorption of Protestantism through colonialism that the text came to be very central, and they became regulated texts of the Quran and all the rest of it. So in a way, what I'm interested in is have these traditions really been as purely preserved as they might claim or might think?
Yeah, well, I think they definitely sort of haven't. I mean, one of the things in the first draft of this book, the introduction was about 40 pages long and was full of caveats and warnings, and I tried to kind of it wasn't the best to start from a reader's point of view, but there are so many pitfalls you have to look for, and essentialism is one of them, sort of, thinking that there is this thing called Indian philosophy, Chinese philosophy, Western philosophy, and they're all absolutely distinct, and as you say, quite hermetically sealed. That clearly isn't the case. Now, in terms of what exactly the different interactions are, I mean, it would kind of take me beyond the scope of the book to look at that. I mean, what's quite some are obvious, and some are obviously sort of negative, as it were, which is quite interesting as well. So, I mean, one of the curious things is that the three great, ancient traditions with the greatest literatures all kind of emerged at more or less the same time, in India and in Confucius in China and in Socrates in the West. And there didn't at that time seem to be any interaction, although curiously enough there was trade between India and ancient Greece. So there would have been some intellectual cross-current there. But as far as I'm aware, there are a couple of books suggesting that the Stoics kind of borrowed from the Buddhists, whatever it might be, but it's all very speculative and hard to pin down. And the Chinese tradition, I think, really did seem to develop. Well, that's not true, because the Buddhism came to China, of course, as well. So you have that progression of Buddhism through China and through Japan. That's one transmission route. Indian philosophy, actually, most parts of the world now, for about the last century at least, most other traditions have openly and willingly studied and learned from Western traditions and perhaps other ones too. So in a weird way, the most hermetically sealed one is the West, because it's chosen to do so. That's kind of it's been its choice, So ironically, going back to the Indian Philosophical Congress, although it seems to be very different and there's this great respect for the traditions, etc., there were lots of people there who were making reference to Kant and to Whitehead and to these Western philosophers in a way that you would not see that honour being reciprocated at a Western one. The unconscious side of things is fascinating. I mean, I think at that level, though, to really know about that, you've really got to be one of those specialists really focusing on an area to really know.
So we've talked about traditions where, broadly speaking, there are texts that we can read and we can understand, and in a way, Confucius is foreign, but also it's familiar because you can look at it. But what about those really other traditions, like an Aboriginal philosophical tradition, or philosophy in Africa, where these things might not even be written down in books, and then maybe philosophies embedded in social forms of life? How do we even begin to approach that?
Yeah, I mean, this does fascinate me. I'd like to sort of find out more about this. Deciding what you're going to include in a book like this, you've got to say, well, you have to make some kind of decision about what counts as philosophy. Now, until a couple of decades ago, really, there was hardly anyone who took seriously the idea that philosophy as such could be found in oral traditions, which didn't leave texts. You would talk rather about, folk traditions, folklore, etc., etc. But increasingly people have come to the view that actually, traditions can create and transmit and preserve and develop philosophical ideas without necessarily leaving any written text. And there are different sort of methodologies people have come up with for trying to kind of extract these, given that the written texts aren't there. I mean, one was, well, I have a terrible memory for names, so I can't remember the names, unfortunately. A very famous guy who's come to me later, had this methodology of what is looking for what he called, sages, or sage philosophers. So he would go to different African villages and everything and talk to the people who were known to be the wise people. But by asking him lots of questions, he would distinguish between those who were simply repeating the old wisdom, etc., and those who did show a particular kind of original insight, way of thinking and development. And these people were honoured with as philosophers. Although, interestingly enough, of course, that seems to be importing the Western assumption that what makes you a philosopher is your originality.
Yeah.
There's a whole other way of thinking, which is that actually a society itself can develop a philosophy which doesn't have a single author. We study our philosophies by the names of the people. It's Aristotle, Kant, etc. Now, again, it's interesting enough, in China, that's not true of Confucius. Although we talk about Confucianism, etc., in the Chinese word for Confucianism is literally translated wisdom learning or something. It doesn't carry the name of Confucius. It was the early Jesuits who sort of called it Confucianism because they thought, well, you know, our traditions, you know, Christianity, we'll name it after their founder. In the same kind of way that for a while people were referred to as the Mohammedans, weren't they?
Yeah.
You know, because of course you name it after your founder. So the other idea there is that, say, particular ways of thinking are sort of embedded in the culture. And if you want to articulate these more systematically, you have to sort of do a job of extraction. Now, that's a fraught process, particularly if the person doing the extraction is not from the culture. Because again, there's always that risk of, you know, distortion, and people talk about cultural appropriation, whatever the phrase might be. But I think these ideas should be taken seriously. They're very least interesting ones. So, for example, you know, the way in which, I mean, so there's lots of diversity, but there do seem to be commonalities, common ways of thinking, which recur over different, more traditional societies, if you like. And one is the way in which they, you know, relate to land, and how the relationship to place has a much greater importance. And place has a greater importance than time, for example. We're very much sort of, time is of the four dimensions, time is the one that seems to be most important in the Western tradition. We think about progress, end game. You could argue this goes back to the Christian eschatological kind of story. But, you know, when place becomes the most important thing, and you're not really as interested in the idea of history as a progression of events and dates, you're more interested in your existence as it relates to a place, and how you and your people relate to a place. That provides a very sort of different way of thinking, which, you know, maybe it just doesn't work in a modern complex society, but I think there are aspects of it that are well worth thinking about, for sure.
What about the idea that when you're faced with these other traditions, do you know, in the book, you know, you seek to understand and to empathise, but to what extent do you bring your own critical faculties and evaluate and say, well, actually, this tradition I feel has ossified, or this tradition has, you know, not been as interesting as it's not at its most interesting point right now. How do you make those? Those judgments?
Well, I just think, honestly, I think, but with caution. I think we have sometimes a misguided idea of respect. That respect means sort of nodding and saying, that's nice, you know. I think it's actually patronising rather than respectful, you know. I mean, I would assume you show respect for people you disagree with in your own culture by assuming they're capable of dealing with your disagreement, if you're civil about it, and assuming that they may well have the intelligence to have some replies to your criticisms, whatever it might be. So for me, you know, being respectful doesn't mean never criticising or not being prepared to criticise. Or if not to criticise, to ask difficult questions, to raise doubts and worries. At the same time, you do have a certain responsibility not to sort of, you know, go in there with all guns blazing, because, you know, obviously, until you know a tradition well, you can't be sure. But, you know, I think when people say, like, you're not allowed to criticise because you don't understand it properly, I mean, on that basis, you get in a position where the only people who are allowed to criticise are complete insiders. So, I mean, you know, for example, look, there are hundreds of different Christian sort of denominations, for example, but you go up to anyone and you say, I don't really buy your view because this, that and the other. Anyone could turn around and say, yes, you know, but if you'd studied it for 30 years like I had, you know, and you haven't studied it for 30 years, have you? So you've got no right to have a view. If you can only have a view on something that you've made your life's work, then we all just have to we are then just stuck in our worldviews. So I think one has to be prepared to be critical if necessary, to ask difficult questions, but to be open about it, and to be, you know, if you're open about it, look, I could be wrong, and I'm coming from I have my own prejudices too, obviously, but this is what it looks like to me. That shouldn't be offensive, and it shouldn't be difficult for people to take, and it should be an encouragement for them to, if they can explain it to you better, explain it to you better. But the right answer is not, you just need to spend more time on this, because, you know.
I was interested, we actually, just rolling back to the beginning, you talked about continental philosophy and how maybe it isn't taught in British universities in the way that it used to be, it is elsewhere. And I'm wondering, the things that we're talking about, it just occurred to me, and feel free to, you know more about science, feel free to shoot me down. So, if we say that the idea of, rationality and enlightenment and the Western tradition, in the last 40 or 50 years, the idea of continental philosophy has been like bringing into doubt the idea of there being, this thing called truth that we can access if only we have the right tools, or in a way reintroducing the idea of, I think, some of these people like Derrida, and they're quite sort of mystical, really, aren't they, in some ways, or they're bringing a sense of mystery to philosophy. And I wonder if you felt that tradition was questioning some of the assumptions of traditional Western philosophy as well, and were there any comparisons to be made with traditions outside Europe?
Yeah, that's a difficult one, I think. I mean, they clearly are questioning that. Yes, I mean, you're right. A big strand of that continental thinking has been right back from Nietzsche, really, to be questioning this idea of truth and knowledge as being attainable and progress. Now, there's been that strand within the Anglophone world at all, but to the extent to which that makes it what is quite interesting is this, that certainly it's the phenomenologists who have resonated more in parts of East Asia. So in Japan, for example, in Japan there's quite a lot of interest in phenomenology, and I think part of that is in the rejection of pure reason, as it were, as a guide to life. One of the sort of premises of phenomenology is you have to kind of start with our experience of the world, how the world seems to us, and give up on the illusion of there being, that you can penetrate the world as it really is. That makes it quite different from, I think, a lot of the Indian traditions, where there is a belief that one can come to a knowledge of the world as it is. But in lots of East Asian traditions, there is a kind of what you might call a kind of a metaphysical agnosticism, that ultimate reality is kind of beyond our comprehension, and that if we can say anything about it at all, it's kind of metaphorical, analogical, and what we need to concentrate on is more, the world as it appears to us, and that world of appearances. And so that has a certain resonance, for sure. I don't know about you say mystical. I mean, maybe that just sounds mystical. I think one of the things that's interesting for me is that, as someone who comes from a tradition in which anything which sort of like foregrounds the ineffable or the inexpressible, etc., I have these alarm bells go off. Mystical obscurantism, blah blah blah. I found that actually, looking at the Japanese philosophy, I did sort of change my mind quite a bit on that. And I think I do now have a sort of a different view of that. That there is something about, there is a way of doing serious philosophy which is about applying your intellect and your concentration and your attention very carefully to things, but that which doesn't necessarily result in simple propositions which you can run through logical arguments. By its nature, it's difficult to talk about because it's allowing for a certain degree of ineffability, and as a result, people will rightly be sceptical that it's kind of hand waving. But actually, we say hand waving. I just thought of this now. Actually, we talk about hand waving as this expression we use when someone's not being basic. You're hand waving. Of course, there's a famous Zen expression which is language is the finger pointing at the moon, right? So the finger pointing at the moon is really a sort of a more poetic and polite and positive way of talking about what we call hand waving. Yeah? It's saying yes, sometimes all you can do is wave your hand and point your finger at the moon. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Julian. I want to open up to questions now. So please do stick your hand up, and Saskia will come round with a microphone. Gentleman over here. Sorry.
Well, those seats look very comfortable. I think you might be. Congratulations for staying awake in them.
This comes from the article you wrote in the Prospect magazine.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that you were saying that the governments should measure and ensuring the preconditions for flourishing, for your well-being. Yeah. Well, did you know that the Government Department of International Affairs are pledged to implement the 17 principles of the United Nations Agenda 2030? I don't know if you know about that, but it's, you know, the principles of well-being.
Right.
They're called the Sustainable Development Goals.
Oh, I see, right, yeah.
Yeah. There's also another one called the Earth Charter, which is sponsored by Stephen Rockefeller, basically. And that deals with an ethical background to these Sustainable Development Goals. And the United Nations won't take that on because the United Nations philosophy is just pragmatic. Like, these goals need to be achieved because we're ruining the planet. And it's mainly based on money when people won't do it because it costs them. Whereas the Earth Charter has an ethical background, and I was wondering if you knew how you would measure the ethical background of the Earth Charter to the pragmatic philosophy of the Agenda 2030.
Well, I won't go into details of Earth Charter and Agenda because I don't know them off the top of my head and I'm not aware of them. But I suppose what you're really, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I suppose the heart of the question is this idea that you perceive there's a difference between having a kind of an ethical agenda for development, government policy and United Nations, everything, and a kind of purely pragmatic one, right? And I suppose what's quite interesting, that is a very interesting question because, you know, the extent to which one can distinguish those things is itself questionable. So, for example, if you look at Chinese moral and political philosophy, for example, in a sense, because there isn't a strong tradition there of having any kind of ideal of the good or as transcendental or the God as transcendental, you know, there isn't really, ethics and pragmatics are one in the same. You know, doing well is about living a good life, constructing a good society, and that's just what it is, kind of, to be good. Now, I think in a sense, when we distinguish between pragmatics and ethics, it tends to have a sort of a derogatory sort of implication for what pragmatics means, because pragmatic for what? And I think, generally speaking, we think pragmatic for the purposes of just economic growth or whatever it might be. But in a way, that's just a very limited form of pragmatism. I think that if you used to be pragmatic, I think a lot of ethics around the world is about what's pragmatic. It says it's what works to create human flourishing, etc. And on that basis, you know, tackling climate change is a pragmatic and an ethical thing, because those two things are the same things, that we pragmatically have to kind of bring climate change under control because that's a precondition for people being able to live good lives, which is an ethical objective, I would suggest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very good. More questions? Yeah, lady there.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Here in the UK, we hear a great deal about the European Court of Human Rights. Do you think if there was such a thing as the Chinese Court of Human Rights, perhaps an Islamic Court of Human Rights, maybe a South American Court of Human Rights, would they be different?
Well, I mean, that's a very good question. We do have the Universal Declaration on Human Rights from the UN, right? And it's a very interesting document, because a lot of the time you hear people say casually, I think, that, you know, human rights is a kind of a Western idea, or at least if it's not a Western idea, the rights we think are most important are the Western ones, and that it's somehow an imposition. And when I've read about and spoken to people who've read about and studied more than me, the process by which that Universal Declaration was put together, the idea of it being a Western imposition just doesn't add up at all. A lot of the most enthusiastic countries for it were non-Western countries, and certainly a lot of people involved in the writing of it were not Westerners. There's a very leading Chinese person involved. So I think that, rights, I think, have occupied a very particular place in sort of the Western political and ethical imagination, primarily because it's sort of the way in which we come to think about rights ties in very well with the kind of individualism which has become very important here. So that the rights are really of individuals, individual liberty, individual freedom. So we've kind of latched onto rights and made a big deal of them. But the kinds of things that the Universal Declaration says are important are found to be pretty much important all over the world, actually. And I don't think there are huge conflicts in that. I think to the extent that there are conflicts, it would be the extent to which people believe that the rights of individuals should be given precedence over greater social stability. You might say rights of groups. Now the point is that is something which is not a black and white either or thing, because we recognise that rights are limited to the extent to which they harm other people. So the harm principle of Mill's harm principle is explicitly that you have a right to do what you want as long as it doesn't infringe on other people's rights. But I think in a sense that's a kind of a very limited caveat. I think in a lot of other cultures that's sort of taken much more seriously, and the idea that one might harm others by having one's own individual liberty is perhaps taken. There are ways of thinking about that which are not obvious. So, for example, you might think, if I think about how would exercising my right harm other people, I'm generally thinking about how exercising my right would literally harm other individuals. If I was to think how exercising my right might kind of not help the fabric of society, to put it that way, that's not something our dominant way of thinking of rights is very strong on. And I think in other cultures they certainly would be. So as I said earlier, in China this dominant concept is of harmony, and it seems very, very important to have a harmonious society. And that really that kind of implies a certain skepticism, I think, about allowing individuals to have too much freedom, which doesn't sound very nice in headline terms, but it's not such a bonkers idea. The way I try and make this, and I realise I'm sort of slightly taking the question in a certain direction, but the way I try and sort of make this sound more sympathetic is, I know a lot of people who have been very, very critical of Western foreign policy in recent years. And a lot of what they say is actually, unbeknown to them, a kind of Confucian argument. They say that basically, in the name of freedom, we've gone into certain countries and completely destroyed their fabric. And what we've got as a result is actually, it's certainly not freedom, but also people living in completely chaotic societies. So what people are really saying is that, in the name of freedom, you should not create too much disharmony in society. It's not a price worth paying. That's kind of Confucius. So if it sounds, I think whenever you start saying, there should be sort of limits on individual freedom and liberty, I think alarm bells go off because people think it implies great oppression and everything, but not necessarily.
Another question, gentleman there.
What was it about Japanese philosophy which made you think again about what I think you described as obscurantist mysticism?
Yeah, okay. So what was it? Well, it's very interesting. It's a short answer to this one. Before I did this, for a long while, I've kind of had this view that the Western self-conception of what it means to be rational places too much emphasis on the idea of logical argument. So it's all about logical argument. And it seemed to me that a very important aspect of all good philosophy is what I was calling attending, right? So if you think about a lot of the real canonical core moments in Western philosophy, they're often reported as though there are arguments, but they're actually often more to do with a philosopher very carefully attending to something about our experience and reaching a conclusion about it. So the simple example would be, as an argument and counter-argument, is Descartes. Descartes is famous for "I think, therefore I am." But in his meditations, he doesn't put it in those forms. He just says, he tries to doubt everything and comes to the conclusion that the one thing he can't doubt is I am, I exist. There's no therefore there. He's saying, and what he's really saying is that the force of the argument, in inverted commas, is attend very carefully to your own experience. Attend very carefully to what happens when you try to doubt. You will find it impossible to doubt your own existence. It is maybe a logical contradiction to do so, but that's not the point. The point is it's an impossibility. Now, Descartes went on to argue that this was some kind of proof of the indivisible self. Hume's argument against that was, again, attending. When I attend most carefully to what I call myself, he says, my own experience, I don't find a self, I simply find a bundle of perceptions, as he calls them. So I think that even in Western philosophy, there's not enough attention paid to the fact that a lot of good thought is actually about the very, very careful attention. And I just found that in Japanese thought, that kind of the Japanese philosophers I spoke to talked about is this aesthetic dimension. So it's about aesthetic not in terms of beauty and everything, but in terms of sensing, feeling, and attending. And I think that I can see that as being quite important. So, for example, in terms of if you think about ethics, for example, thinking morality, we tend to, again, perhaps largely because of the Judeo-Christian tradition, when we think about ethics, we're always looking for principles and for rules and guidance. There is a tradition, though, which is in Confucius and is Aristotle and also in Hume, which says the basis of morality isn't that; it's kind of moral sentiment, feeling. And I think again, so to me, again, there's a sense there you can see how the attending to things is actually very important for ethics. But perhaps the most significant thing is actually the ethical, not in terms of morality, but how we foster the right attitude to life, to our mortality and all these things, how we deal with meaning in life. And I think that's where I think the Japanese tradition is kind of strongest, because it seems to me that, again, articulating it is quite difficult, but Japanese thought, which includes a lot of poetry and art as well, I think is often about trying to sort of make one attentive to the transience of things and the impermanence of things, and that the way things contain both beauty and sadness, this wabi-sabi thing. And that's something that you can explain to a certain amount with language, but to truly develop it, you have to cultivate a way of relating to the world. You have to focus upon the way in which you see things and perceive things. And it seems to me there's such a lot of truth in that, which I can relate to, that again makes me sympathetic. What I remain unsympathetic towards is views that by entering certain special states of consciousness, you can perceive reality as it truly is beyond appearances. That's a whole different thing, and that's the kind of mysticism I don't buy. But that's not really sort of mainstream. In sort of Buddhist thought and so forth, there are certain schools and thoughts which kind of seem to claim that, but I think there's a lot which is not about that at all. It's a more sensitive attention to things.
Very good. Maybe we've time for a couple more. There's a question at the back.
Hello, thanks, Julian. This is a kind of innocence abroad question. Mary Midgley, don't be disturbed. She gave her last interview to Prospect. Surely there's nothing we should read into that, but
Prospect killed me.
Don't be scared. Her last book, and I've not read any of her work, and I'm coming to all this relatively new. What is Philosophy For? Should I put it next to your book on my bookshelf? Should I read you first and her second, or the other way around? Did you know her? Could you talk a little bit about that?
I interviewed Mary Midgley many years ago. I've not read all her works by any stretch. I think she's done some interesting work. I think, unfortunately, she became a bit. She had this unfortunate disagreement with Richard Dawkins, which I think became a bit of an obsession. She should have backpedaled on it, and she didn't, because she wrote a paper in which she said, Dawkins is saying we're all selfish because they're selfish. And it was a misunderstanding, a very simple misunderstanding. Because Dawkins' selfish gene was not saying that we are selfish because of our genes. He was saying, it was a metaphor. But she kind of stuck rather doggedly to that and said, "Oh, these metaphors matter, etc." And she's right to a certain extent. And I think that an unfortunate side effect, unintended side effect of Dawkins is that a lot of people have assumed that selfish gene means we're selfish. So, but this is a sort of a long way of saying that I think although she said some very interesting things, I think she's got a bit of a dog at a bone on a few things. And I think some of her earlier works... Sorry?
So a different shelf.
A different shelf, no, but maybe one of her earlier works. I think Man and Beast, I think, is the one which...
Yeah, that's a really interesting...
Which a lot of people... I mean, I read one of hers which was around the same time, which was pretty good. I think I would if you're going to read Mary Midgley, I'd go back to that. I wouldn't read her most recent one, she's a bit like the Rolling Stones, really. All their best work was done quite a long time ago.
Yeah, no, Beast and Man is really interesting because ironically it was actually more about acknowledging the power of sociobiology and bringing it into philosophy and saying, well, actually people like E.O. Wilson and the rest of it, philosophers have to deal with this, with this new scientific breakthroughs. But one more question, maybe the gentleman. Or we'll take both of you, one after the other, and then we'll come.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm hoping it's going to answer a sort of fundamental question that's dogged me for most of my life, which is the conflict between the East and the West. And the conflict is the West is focused on progress and, well, it's a fairly simplistic view, but the West is focused on progress and destroying the planet, and the East, you need some sort of meditative quality to your philosophy, your life vision. And I'm just hoping you will shed some light on that.
Oh, shed some light. Well, I'll tell you one thing I shed light.
I'm hoping your book does.
Yeah, thank you. No, but I have to say, I stand on the shoulders of giants, standing on the shoulders of giants. There were really useful people who I spoke to, and one of the people I quote a lot, I'm very grateful to, is a guy called Tom Kasoulis, who's a very good comparative philosopher, who not only says great things about Japanese philosophy, he virtually everything you want to say about the whole project of comparative philosophy, he's found the right way to put it. And one thing I think is so useful, and every time I talk about the book, I always come back to this, is that he says that you've always got to remember that, we are, in a sense, I'm paraphrasing in a big way, we are all humans, we're all doing the same kind of things, we have a lot of similarities. You don't find in these different traditions of thoughts binary opposites. It's just not like that. It's not the East is this, the West is that, blah, blah, blah. But what is important and significant is, and this is his way of putting it, is that what's background in one culture or philosophy tends to be foreground in the other, and vice versa. So I think what I find really helpful about that metaphor is that once you start looking at it in those ways, the metaphor I use is it's like, as human beings taking a philosophical view of the world, it's kind of like we have this mixing desk, like mixing desks in recording studios, and they've all got these different kind of concepts, like, whatever it might be, attention, reason, logic, virtue, harmony, rights, justice. And it's like we've all got the same desk, but in the different cultures, they're turned up different levels. And in some, they're turned down so low they're as good as absent. And in some, they're turned up so high they're drowning everything else, but they're kind of all there. So I hope that what you find is that at the end of the book, you're not so much thinking now of East and West in these kind of dichotomous terms, but seeing how, that it's just the different way in which we're making use of the same palette of concepts. And of course, the result can be very different in total, so they're not insignificant differences, but it is background, foreground,
Thank you very much for taking my question. If you were asked to draft a code of conduct or a code of ethics, first of all, would you accept that challenge? It sounds like you might not have given what you said about the Japanese philosophies. What would be in that code, bearing in mind all of the different philosophies that you have learned about whilst drafting your book?
Yeah, okay. I think that's, again, I wouldn't a code as such. I mean, actually, to sort of put my cards on the table, when it comes to ethics, I am much more in tune with both Confucius and Aristotle, who are remarkably similar on ethics. And both of them are very suspicious of rules and principles. And they thought instead what you really need to do is to cultivate good character. And this sounds wishy-washy to some people. So what does it mean to have good character? But we kind of do know what it means to have good character. And we also kind of know that people of good character don't tend to be rigid when it comes to matters of ethics. They tend to exercise good judgment. And it's the sort of like people who are sort of ethically unskilled who always insist that this is the rule, so I must follow it. Now, of course, when you're in politics and in law, unfortunately, you do need to have rigid laws. But just because in law we need to make rigid decisions, and so when I'm talking about governments, I would say let's have rule of law, right, and let's not have discretion. In terms of ethics in general, you've got to cultivate good virtue and character. I think that's really important. And actually, I'm quite evangelical about it. I think it's the missing dimension in a lot of corporate ethics and business ethics, because a lot of people, I think, in business are serious about wanting to be better. Most people do not want to be destroying the world or their children's future in their business activity. So they want to be good, and they drag in these consultants and everything, and what they do is they come up with codes of conduct and rules and principles, but it doesn't affect the culture. And so you've got like a company like, to give a trivial example, not a trivial, it's a serious example, a company like Starbucks, which is obviously a big organisation and really wants to be good, and it tries to do that by having rules that everyone can follow. It's often precisely because of those rules that people do stupid things. So the case of the guy the whole row with the two black guys who were guilty of being black in the vicinity of a Starbucks a few years back, actually that all started because the rules said the toilets were for customers and they wanted to use the toilets. And that's what started the tension, Whereas, shows discretion, be kind, it would never have got started, yeah.
Thanks so much for that. We've run over, but thanks so much for a wonderful talk and discussion, Julian. Thank you, the audience, for some really, really good questions, top quality. Just a quick advert for what's coming next year. We've got Sarah Langford coming in January, talking about the law and women. A new book should be fascinating. In February, we've got Peter Frankopan coming, talking about the new Silk Roads. So again, China will feature heavily in that as well. China Rising, or Risen, really. Andrew Roberts' new biography of Churchill. It's a whopper. And then Sue Prideaux talking about Nietzsche, her biography.
That'll be good.
That should be good as well. And then the rearranged book club from December. So Dylan McCulloch is going to come in May to talk about Thomas Cromwell.
I don't know if anyone is in this evening for Dermot McCulloch. I'm sorry, I'm not Dermot McCulloch.
Absolutely brilliant to have you, Julian. And there'll be a book signing afterwards, so please do come and chat to Julian and get hold of a copy of the book. It's brilliant. I advise you to do that. And please also come to the drinks reception, which is you go up the stairs, you turn left at the drinks reception, and right for the book signing. But thank you very much for coming, and thank you, Julian.
Thank you.